Hello, everyone. It's Francis Widdowson here. Today, I'm being joined by Trevor Tomesh, Dr. Trevor Tomesh, who is a computer science professor at the University of Wisconsin. Thank you very much, Trevor, for agreeing to discuss some of the areas with respect to academic freedom, the University of Regina, and your situation that transpired
My
there.
pleasure. My pleasure.
Anyway, so for people who are unaware of what's going on October 3rd, I was supposed to be given two talks at the University of Regina. One was on indigenization and academic freedom, lessons from the Francis Widdowson case, where I talk about how indigenization contributed directly to my being pushed out of that university, Mount Royal University. And the second one was going to be the grave error at Kamloops. Should it be described as a hoax? And for the record, I don't really think it should be. I think that it's not very helpful to describe it that way, although I am open to having my mind changed in that regard. But anyway, that's just because people are probably thinking that I do think it's a hoax, and I don't. That's not my position on it. I want to investigate. I wanted to investigate the different positions on people saying it should be called a hoax and people saying that it should not be, and investigating that academically in this talk. Anyway, Trevor knew ahead of time, quite early on, that this is what I was going to be doing there. And Trevor said to me, good luck with that. Yeah, that's not going to really go over very well at the University of Regina. And I know the president of the University of Regina, whose name is Jeff Keshen. I worked with Jeff Keshen for several years at Mount Royal University, and he was a pretty good dean. He was the dean of arts. He was a very nice guy, which doesn't help you very much in these situations. But he always supported my academic freedom and actually helped me facilitate discussions on indigenizing Mount Royal University. He, in fact, provided funding for a very large event that I held in, I believe it was 2017, called Indigenizing the University. What are the academic implications? So I thought I had a relatively good shot at that as well. Robert Thomas, who is a librarian there, is the president of the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship. So it was my hope that his position and his name would help to facilitate these events. But wasn't too long after it had been announced that David Gregory, who's the provost, put pressure on Robert Thomas, and then it was suggested that the events be held off campus. And then Robert got an email from John Smith, who is the vice president, student affairs, saying that there was a safety risk, and to protect the safety of students, faculty, and me, he's thinking about me. These talks could not go ahead. I sent an email then to Jeff Keshen suggesting that I have a Spectrum Street epistemology session in a room, because this would presumably make things quote unquote safer, in the sense that I wouldn't be out in the public. People could choose to go to talk. Not that I was not afraid whatsoever of any physical, danger or anything like that. And then I got another email from John Smith saying it didn't matter what I was doing there. I wouldn't be allowed to do that because of these safety concerns. And he strongly recommended that I not show up on campus and conduct an unauthorized event, because I was suggesting that I would come. If I didn't get a room, I would be coming anyway to do the Spectrum Street epistemology on academic freedom there. So anyway, so that's kind of a bit of the background for what went on. Daniel Page, who also was a computer science professor at University of Regina, who had difficulties of his own concerning making critical comments about targeted hiring of people with LGBTQ identities. He did something very innocuous on LinkedIn, and he was subjected to disciplinary procedures. Anyway, Daniel Page and I are currently doing a documentary on what I will call the University of Regina Rumble, which also has its tentacles into the Regina Public Library events that we booked instead. And it turned out that a number of people at the University of Regina were agitating behind the scenes to make it very difficult to hold those talks at the University of Regina. So this is a shameful circumstance that existed. There's a lot of factors at play. Anyway, Trevor is here to give us a bit of a insider's view of what goes on at the University of Regina, and as well his own particular troubles that he had there. But before you start getting into that, Trevor, perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and what your educational circumstances
Sure.
are and your role and your career as a professor so far.
Yeah, sure. Well, I grew up in rural Wisconsin, the United States. So Canada was interesting for me. I got my bachelor's degree from the University of Wisconsin, and then I went off to England, spent a couple of years working on my PhD in England, and then changed gears and moved to then Canada. That would have been I moved to Canada in 2012, 2013, somewhere in there, to do my PhD at the University of Regina. And I just want to preface, I'm coming at this as an alumni of the University of Regina. I'm very concerned with especially the academic freedom angle. I'm very concerned with the curtailment of academic freedom at the University of Regina and everywhere. The curtailment of academic freedom is a very important problem that I think we need to address. And it's not just the University of Regina. So I have to say that I've seen campuses even down here in the United States that have had curtailment of academic freedom, mostly on the private side, but that's a different topic. But anyhow, so I spent from 2012 to 2020 working on my PhD work, which was in computer science. And then in 2020, I did finally get my PhD. All the while, I was teaching as a sessional lecturer from 2000, I believe, 15 up until like 2020 when I got my PhD. I was doing sessional work. I then, after that, had applied and got what they call a lecturer position. So it's not a sessional lecturer; it's supposed to be a 3-year lecturing position. About a year and a half into that, I got the opportunity down here to do a tenure track assistant professorship, which is currently where I'm at the University of Wisconsin as an assistant professor in computer information and data science. And so that is where I'm at with that.
Okay. So in terms of your teaching, so you taught for 5 years at the University of
I
Regina?
taught 5, 6, 7 years, 2015 to 2022 was when I finally finished. I taught at different levels. I taught when I was a grad student. I did most of my teaching as a grad student at the sessional level. And then for the last couple of years that I was in Canada, I did teaching at the would then the lecturer level. So like a kind of a contract, like, all right, sorry, a full-time lecturer position as opposed to sessional lecturer position.
Okay. And what made you choose the University of Regina to do your PhD there?
Well, there was a couple of different things that happened. It was, first of all, my ex-wife, her family had moved to Regina because her father had remarried a Canadian. They moved to Regina, and we said, hey, this England thing isn't quite working out. Let's go join your family in Canada. And so I took up a PhD there, working under a wonderful supervisor who to this day, I'm still actually working with on some some research work from what my PhD was. And yeah, but I moved there in 2012 because I mostly just found that the research that was being done there was something that I would be interested in doing. And so then I was pretty happy the first few years there for sure.
All right. So that gives us a bit of a background. And what was your PhD on?
Well, my PhD was in computer science, and it was on basically some abstract, not some abstract, but some odd field within computer science called information theory. And so my PhD was the topic of the thesis was interactive hardware systems, an approach to general systems theory. So I'll spare you the boring details, but basically a lot of kind of abstract computer architecture stuff is what I was working on.
Okay. So you mentioned that you were pretty happy there the first couple of years that you were
Mhm.
working at the University of Regina, studying at the University of Regina. What what kind of when did things start to become a bit troubling for you with respect to academic freedom, open inquiry, those sorts of areas?
So things started going awry for me when I kind of started identifying as a conservative. Back in 2016, when the election happened, when Hillary Clinton was defeated by Donald Trump, I could not believe that that would ever happen. And so I went through a bit of an existential period, a bit of existential crisis, and started rethinking my position on a lot of things. Because clearly, the way that I viewed the world when I came to Canada, I was I was a socialist atheist. But I began to view the world differently because I realized that my worldview was not correct, at least insofar as the outcomes that I knew were given did not occur. And so I started listening to other people. Jordan Peterson actually had a huge influence on my thinking. I read his book in response to a group of people that I hung out with wanting to protest one of his talks. And of course, they told me as an American, they told me, don't read his book. He's an evil, transphobe, white supremacist kind of guy. And I said, well, you just said exactly what you needed to say for me to read his book. You told me not to do something as an American. Of course, I'm going to say, well, now I have to. So I read his book and started really becoming more and more conservative. And the further along I went, the more conservative I got. Now, where it really kind of came to a head was in 2020. And so 2020 was, as you probably recall, the Wet'suwet'en protest. So the Wet'suwet'en land defenders were protesting their land being, I believe, used for pipeline. And so, whatever, it was really annoying to me because there was here me trying to acclimate to being Canadian, and I wanted to be a Canadian, and seeing people constantly disparaging this country that I thought was really great. And then seeing the terrorist attacks on the train tracks, which I'm sorry, they were terrorist attacks. They lit fire literally to the train tracks and were blocking it. But when it really came to a head was when we were being asked, and I actually have the email somewhere here on my computer. I can just pop that up.
We will be getting
But
that email.
yep, you will. I will send that to you. But
I
I was
can't
being
wait.
asked. So this was February 14th, 2020. I got an email, and this email was sent to the University of Regina listserv, and it was titled "Round Dance in Solidarity with Wet'suwet'en." And they were basically encouraging us over the official University of Regina listserv to participate in a blockade of Albert Street, which is the kind of main street there in Regina. And this had happened a few times in the past because this was once again in February when this whole thing was really hot, and it had happened a few times in the past, the blockade. But this was the first time that I noticed that they actually were encouraging us. They meaning whoever was helping organize this. And so they wanted us as employees to, at least they're using the official listserv to participate in what to me seemed like a political activity. And of course, I was at that point identifying openly, essentially, as conservative, and I said, "This is not okay. You should not be promoting this sort of uh, dangerous activity, and B, these sort of political activities through the official channels. What are you doing?" And that went ignored. I got really annoyed after the round dance had occurred on Albert Street, because I was not happy about people being able to leverage their identities in order to break the law and not get reprimanded for it. And so I, of course, me being the loudmouth American I am, I went on Twitter and I took the news article and I clipped it and I said, "Oh, great, a bunch of grown ass adults are playing in the street again." And that was the nail in the coffin for me as far as my future as a academic in Canada, because very soon after that, actually it wasn't very soon, it was a few months after I had said that, this would have been June, I wound up getting a call from my department head at the time, and my department head called me up and said, "Trevor, we've got to talk about your social media." And I was like, "Oh, do we?" Because I had never encountered this before. It's like, oh, this it seemed inappropriate for my department head to be talking to me about my personal social media. My personal social media, by the way, had absolutely nothing to do, no affiliation with the university, and I'm very careful even today to make sure that there's no affiliation. My views are my own, and they're often at odds with these universities. And so I said, "Well, what's going on?" And he said, "Did you say that did you say," and he quoted me what I said, and I said, "Yes, absolutely." And he said, "Well, that's hate speech." And I said, "What do you mean that's hate speech?" And of course, as an American, hate speech is a foreign idea to me.
Yes,
It's
yes,
not
yes.
something that it's not something that we have. And he said, "Well, it's hate speech because you are criticizing a group of people, an identifiable group, and this is hate speech. And of course, when I hear the word hate speech, my blood runs cold, and I'm like, okay, well, what happens? And he said, at this point, I was about to actually get my PhD. This was shortly before my PhD was coming in the mail. I was actually fixing and resub.
You just went, you're not, your sound went off.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
I don't know what happened. My phone. Anyhow, so this was when I was in that time when I was like doing revisions on my PhD thesis, and I had been negotiating with my department a 3-year paid postdoctoral position. As you know, that's very common, and so that was kind of my plans. But he said to me, uh, "I've been contacted by a number of people higher up in management, and that postdoc that we were thinking about doing, it's gone." And I said, "What do you mean it's gone?" And he said, "It's gone. It never existed, Trevor." I'm like, "Okay." And he said, we talked a little bit longer, and then later on he had said something to the effect of, um, there he said, "I think that they will let you," I don't know who they is, I think it was the dean, but said, "I think they will let you finish out this semester as a lecturer, but don't expect to ever have a job as a lecturer at this university again." And that that sent me, of course, into a depression. I am somebody who loves to teach. That's my life. I want to teach. If I'm not teaching, I don't know what else I do as a I don't know what else I do as a career. But anyhow, so this was, of course, before they wound up giving me this term position that I had later on, the lecturer position. So I did wind up getting some redemption there later on. But that did not come to fruition. My banishment from teaching did not come to fruition. Thank God for that. But And then there were several other instances after that that were kind of along the same lines. As I did not shut up on social media, as I am not want to do, and I wound up having the same conversation like three more times or two more times. I think it was three more times about this, and um, yeah, it's funny. After the third time they try to cancel you, I literally said, he said, well, what do you have to say about this? And I just basically said, well, did you try telling them to, excuse my language, to fuck off? And it's like, oh, I can't do that. I'm like, well, no, you can. You can just
Yeah.
tell them
Yeah.
and that's literally what I said. You could tell
Yeah.
them to go away.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I realized that I couldn't be myself. I couldn't be an openly conservative person who doesn't buy the identity politics, doesn't buy the whole indigenization, decolonization thing, and have a future in Canada. So I started looking elsewhere, and then now I'm found my place back where I started in Wisconsin. So I'm very happy to be here, and so I'm kind of glad at how things went down because it really helped me get to the place that I think I needed to be.
Yes. And in terms of in terms of your discipline, what
Mm-hmm.
was the exact discipline that you received?
Yeah, so it was a re-education. So I went and yeah, yep, that's what it was. I was told to complete a one of those one of those silly workplace like
Safety in the workplace.
yeah, one of those things that they usually give you at the beginning when you're getting onboarded about workplace. I think it was like workplace discrimination or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah.
And the dean had me go through that, and so that was kind of part of the penance. And I think if I recall correctly, I had to write something confirming that I learned from it. I'm not 100% sure. It's been 4 years now, but I do know that I had to do that workplace re-education course,
Yeah.
and I think actually Daniel had to do the same thing.
Yes, I think so too.
So
Yeah, yeah. And did you get a letter of warning or a letter of reprimand or a suspension or anything like that?
I didn't wind up getting any kind of letter of reprimand or warning. It was all verbal, and it was yeah, it was all verbal. So there was nothing written, other than forward I had forwarded to me the original kind of complaint. And so the original complaint was actually through the University of Regina Student Union. And so a bunch of I got essentially Twitter mobbed. A bunch of people. There's a couple of ringleaders that I know who they are, but there's a couple of ringleaders that were agitating. I believe that they were students at the time, not of mine. I've never had a
Yeah,
student
yeah, yeah.
but students elsewhere. Like I think First Nations University was actually where they were
Yeah.
um, doing the typical online canceling thing where they see something that they disagree with, they screenshot it, and then they tag at University of Regina. Is this the kind of person that you like working on your staff, sort of thing?
Yeah.
Um, and then, of course, the university have to respond in some way. I mean, they don't have to, but they do.
Mm.
And the student union was the one who actually emailed screenshots of what I had said. Which included stuff like criticizing the idea of the word colonizer. I also had done some commentary on Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins had said something about he was talking about eugenics, and I made some commentary on that, agreeing with not eugenics, but agreeing with Richard Dawkins' uh, assertion that eugenics does work, but it's immoral, kind of thing. And I think it was kind of obvious. He got dragged for that as well. But he made this innocuous statement. Maybe you remember it, but
I
he made this
do.
innocuous. Yeah, yeah. And so I said, yeah, he's right about this. It just because something works doesn't mean we should do it, right?
Mm.
And so they clipped that. They also clipped me. Just what I thought was innocuous stuff personally. And yeah, and sent that off to the University of Regina Students Union.
Yeah.
And yeah, that spelled the end for me, at least so far as my adventures in Canada went.
Okay. And so, so that's great. That gives us a bit of an understanding of your own personal situation. In
Yep.
terms of the University of Regina itself, you and I had quite a few chats about the University of Regina. It seems to be a particularly corroded institution comparatively to
Yep.
others. Do you have could you just explain the kind of atmosphere that generally exists there? And I'm also particularly concerned. Did you have any support from your union? What was the nature of the union at the
Mm,
University of Regina?
Well, so the University of Regina in general, and as much as I do owe them gratitude for my PhD,
Mm.
which I do, but really they are a woke activist institution.
Mm.
That's in their bones, all the way down to the strategic, all the way down to their strategic. What do they call it? The strategic statement of values.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, the strategic. Yeah, thank you. Strategic plan. I mean, I'm sure you've read it. It's an activist manifesto. It is a woke activist manifesto,
Yeah.
and at its core, I mean, University of Regina is at its core. Uh, they have taken the idea of indigenization to their bones, and I mean that's the intention, right? Um, Everything they do has some tinge of pro-indigenization, anti-colonizer. Every single thing they do. There are 3 different centers there for indigenization. There is the Tatawa Student Center, which is Tatawa Indigenous Student Center. There is the Center for Indigenization, which is apparently a separate center from that. And then there's a third one that is something like the Aboriginal or Indigenous Student Success Center. So they have 3 different, all in that same. And then, of course, separate from that, they also have the First Nations University. And it's like, okay, they're focusing laser focus on one segment of the population, and they also frequently have things like smudging. I mean, I was really confused that they were doing smudging in the science center, and especially back when I was during my atheist days, I saw this and I was kind of like, well, this is kind of weird. How would you like it if they like had a Catholic mass right out there in the middle? It's kind of the same thing. But the atmosphere there, people are obviously very, very concerned about saying the wrong thing. And this is one thing that I mean, throughout Canada, that as an American, I noticed when I got there, is that there's this undercurrent that everybody, it's a emperor has no clothes sort of thing. Everybody can see the radical, the descent into radical wokeism, but nobody is, I don't know, maybe brave enough really to come out and say, hey, this is nuts, we need to stop this.
Yeah.
Over fear of being called racist, right? Which I think is ridiculous. Criticizing, for example, the criticism of the 215 murdered Indigenous children, right? Criticizing that, despite the fact that there have been no bodies recovered, is enough to end a career, which is ridiculous. And so I felt that constantly. One thing I do remember specifically when we were talking about the role of women in STEM, me and a supervisor was talking about the role of women in STEM. He was promoting an idea of like kind of trying to get more girls into computer science. And he said something to the effect of, well, there's so many men in computer science. And I said, well, I don't necessarily see that as a problem per se. And he said, well, why do you think there are so many men and so few women in computer science? And I said, well, because psychologically speaking, women tend to be more interested in people, and men on average tend to be more interested in things. I mean, that explains it, I would say, better than some sort of oppressive patriarchy, would it not? He immediately shut the door and sat down and said, you can't say that. And I said to him, and this was eye-opening. I said to him, but it's the truth. The studies are clear. And he said, and I'll never forget this for the rest of my life, I know it's the truth, but you can't say that. And
Yeah.
that really kind of spelled it out to me. I was like, oh my, this is a different, this is a different world. This is a different.
Yeah. Well, the scary thing is you mentioned the emperor has no clothes, which is that is a kind of a disturbing thing, that phenomenon. But even worse is when there is a child who does recognize the falsity, then
Yeah.
people either don't care or they ostracize and push out the child when they say that. So it's almost like a redoubling of the kind of self-censorship and everything that happens, because there's no reaction, no appropriate reaction to that situation. And I've seen that time and time again. And that's kind of what made me think initially, because I thought all you need to do is just have the courage to stand up and say what is true, and people will finally, the veil will lift, and people will then sort of stand behind you. But it's much harder than that, and I'm really starting to realize that's the case.
Yeah, well, and me being the naive American, I basically was that child, right?
Yeah, yeah, no, it's very, very disappointing, especially your colleagues who, you would hope that there would be at least some of them who would, and to speak for myself, I do have some colleagues who have helped me a lot, and some have done it publicly. And I'm in a much better position than most people are usually in these kinds of scenarios. So in terms of the events that happened with respect to what we're calling the University of Regina Rumble on October 3rd, which had its tentacles into all sorts of other areas as well. What is your impression of that, or what are your thoughts on what happened there?
Well, I was worried about you in the first place because you said you were going to the University of Regina. I mean, I knew for sure that there would be some sort of backlash. It's just the nature of the environment of that place.
Yeah,
There was that, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but there was a poet that was scheduled to come and give, a talk. And because of his, not because of his, like anything to do with him, but he was, I don't know if he was friends or acquaintances with somebody who had perpetrated violence against some Indigenous women. And I don't remember off the top of my head. Maybe you can cut it in later. But
yeah,
he was given the choice. He was very strongly encouraged, like you were, to not come and do harm to the students, to reopen
yeah,
wounds.
yeah.
And so, I mean, I was interested in that because I was like, well, this is, if they want to cancel this guy, he must have something interesting to say. And
Mm,
so I was part of a student, as a graduate student, I was part of a student free speech club on campus,
yeah,
which I'm sure doesn't exist anymore.
mm,
And one of the things that we wanted to do was we wanted to be able to maybe debate after this was canceled, have a debate over whether or not that was the appropriate thing to do, was to back out of it. I believe that he backed out. I'm not 100% certain,
I
but I believe.
believe he did too. And
Yeah.
but the dean, I believe there was a dean who was in the economics department who got raked over the coal. Like, he actually kind of stood up as an administrator in defense of allowing, and I believe his name was George Clark or George Eliot. I can't remember. He was black too. That was the other interesting thing, is
That
he was
sounds
a
about right.
black
Yeah.
he was a black poet, but that didn't save him. And
No.
and as well, he seemed to me to be a little bit woke himself. So
Yep.
this was a bit of a problem. Like, if you have a woke kind of association, it's going to be more difficult for you to
Yeah.
be brazen and say, I don't care. I'm here. I'm a poet. I make judgments about, and that was it. He had his work, this guy who I believe had murdered an Indigenous woman. He had a poem from him in his book, which
Yes.
he was thinking of maybe reading I remember him talking about this, and his argument, which I think has a great deal of validity, is that, I am judging this poetry for its own sake, and you can just extract that poetry from the poet who wrote it. You can still appreciate the words, the sounds, the thoughts without getting into that. And of course, that is not an acceptable opinion in the
Yeah.
current kind of
Yeah.
environment. So there's a lot of things going on, and I followed the case quite closely because I was very disturbed at what had happened there. And I remember that it was a huge, it was just, there's nothing good that came out of it. It was all just complete censoriousness, and there was no space for any discussion of the variety of possible responses that
Yeah,
could
and
be.
I tried working for this free speech, this little free speech club that we had going on. I tried to reach out and maybe, I said, me being the naive American, I said, maybe we can have a conversation about this. Can we maybe do an event? I would be prepared to sit and personally debate about the pros and cons of allowing something like this to go forward. And so I was advised to contact they were the Aboriginal Student Center at the time. They changed the name to Tatawa because the word Aboriginal they thought was derogatory for some reason.
Yeah.
And I reached out to them and I said, hey, do you have somebody who would want to maybe have this discussion? I think it's an important thing to have. And so what I did wind up having was a hour-long virtue signaling campaign by somebody who I can't remember who it was exactly, but somebody who the student center had sent on their behalf as a advocate. And he basically, was saying we don't want to open up old wounds, and we don't want to re-traumatize people, and so on and so forth too. Which I just I did not buy at all. But so it never actually materialized because they refused to have the discussion. Because to them,
Yeah.
and by them I mean the type of the type of woke people who believe that speech is violence. The worst thing you can do is to talk about something that's uncomfortable because you might re-traumatize or might harm somebody. And honestly, I think that any good therapist would tell you, no, you don't avoid topics that bother you. You don't avoid topics that hurt you. You discuss them, you deal with them, you take them and you dissect them. But that's not what happened. What happened was they just never materialized.
Yes. So I have two final questions.
Sure.
The first one is about mobilization of students by either faculty members or administrators, various kind of student support people. Did you experience anything like that at the University of Regina?
So there is one group on campus called the Regina Public Interest Research Group, RPERG. You may have heard of it. And they're pretty much, to my knowledge, to how I understand them, they're essentially a radical woke think tank that has a lot to do with these sort of mobilizing students into activism. I hope that I'm getting that right, but that was my impression, at least. Maybe I'm totally off base with my impression of what they were. But it seemed to me like a lot of the activism tended to come from that group. But as far as professors mobilizing students, hard for me to speak to that because but I can tell you from a faculty member, though, as a faculty member, we were being constantly encouraged to virtue signal in one way or another. For example, we were asked, how can we? We want you to consider how you can incorporate indigenous ways of knowing into your curriculum. That was one thing that I just found laughable because, like, how can I and why would integrate indigenous ways of knowing into computer science? It's like, can you show me an indigenous computer? Uh,
Well, you could
it,
have smudging. You could start your class off with a territorial land acknowledgement and do a smudging to cleanse the room of the evil spirits.
Hey, that was another thing that they encouraged us to do, was to start off, maybe put a land acknowledgement in your syllabus. They fell short of requiring it,
Yeah.
although I wouldn't be surprised if now in the 2 years since I've been gone, if they did. But yeah, they fell short of basically acknowledging it. And I mean, I personally would not have done that. I would have refused.
Mm.
Um, and I probably would have gotten in trouble, but I did refuse to put that in my syllabus
Yeah, yeah,
because
yeah.
it just seemed it was irrelevant, right?
And what does it say for the students who don't like it? It immediately creates a tone where your students are given a signal that this is the right way for them to think.
Yeah.
That's what happens. And that's what is people don't understand is that all these kinds of politicized initiatives do that. And then there's a pretense that somehow this is the actual consensus. And I saw that big time on October 3rd with these students telling me that because no one was there to support me, this was somehow indicative that I was wrong and they were right, when I was trying to say to them, look, I have had experiences in the past where, a professor, and this was at University of Lethbridge, a professor that I know there contacted me by email asking me if he could, this before I knew him, if I could provide him with the Zoom link because other professors that he knew were afraid to contact me because they didn't want it to be known that they might just want to listen to
Yep.
what I had to say, not agree with me, but just to listen to me. And that is, a serious problem when you have
Yep.
people who are afraid to speak up, either because they fear being some kind of disciplinary thing, or they just feel their career is not going to be going ahead the way they want it to. It might not necessarily be a punishment. It just might be they don't get the promotion. They don't get, all the various things that happen if you are shown to be on the right side of this question. And it has a serious distorting impact on the
Yep.
institution. Very, very distorting, which, if we want to have, pursuit of truth, those kinds of ideals, you have to be very conscious about the kinds of messaging that you're giving to the students and to the faculty members.
Yeah. Well, and that's why, I mean, even down here, I mean, part of being in the university, I've accepted is, as a conservative in the university, I am in the minority, and I'm okay with that. I don't mind that at all.
Yeah.
But I think that there's a number of barriers to having people of unorthodox opinions and ideas at university. I think that there's a few barriers that are systemic. There are also, of course, just the sort of personalities that want to go into something like higher education. So I would never advocate for like affirmative action for conservatives.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would
Exactly.
never do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Conservatives, we tend to be more conscientious and less open, which doesn't necessarily lead to the desire to do an academic career. That leads to the desire to start a business and to go into industry. And so, I mean, that explains a lot of it. But there are barriers to allowing uh, unorthodox thought. Um, and these barriers, first of all, include DEI statements. The
Mm.
DEI statements, by default, if I'm going to be honest, I cannot sign a DEI statement. If I'm
Mm.
going to be honest,
Yeah.
I cannot sign a DEI statement. It is literally in opposition to everything that I believe.
Exactly.
Um, and so that's your first barrier. It's like you cannot claim to want or to promote a marketplace of ideas, which actually the Canadians have kind of abandoned that entirely, I
Oh,
think.
yeah. Totally.
Um, but the even pretending that they're a marketplace of ideas.
Oh,
There's a lot
no,
of the
no, no.
Canadian
They're telling
institutions.
you that they're not going to allow you to have this view. Like that's what's going on now, and I've seen it
Yeah.
change myself. Like I was in the same position of you. Oh, I'm a socialist of the George Orwell persuasion, but even that doesn't matter because my position on identity politics is a critical one, and so it's really that it's sort of the criticism of wokeism and the totalitarian identity politics. That's the issue, I think, in universities, not the particular left wing, right wing kind of sort of dynamics that go on. Um,
Mhm.
and the final thing I want to ask you about is about the union, the
Yeah.
University of Regina Faculty Association. What was your sense? Because that's another huge problem, which I don't think people understand. And I have firsthand knowledge of this because I've just fought it out and I will continue to fight my case out as far as I can take it. And in order to do that, you're reliant on your faculty association. And when you have a faculty association that is woke and has been captured, that makes things particularly challenging. And I'm just wondering what your sense of the faculty association was at the University of Regina.
Well, they didn't help me too much. They came to like my meeting with when I had meetings with the dean, talking about how are we going to go forward. And they kind of just sat there, took notes. Afterwards, they did talk to me and said, "Well, what do you want to do?" And kind of like advised me, but other than like saying, "Well, maybe you should just do the training." If like they asked me, do you want to keep your job, or because or do you want to, continue on this path that you're on? And I'm like, well, I want to keep my job. And they're like, okay, so I advise you to do the training. And basically that's all the more that I got out of them.
Mm.
But yeah, they're woefully woke, and I've seen this many times with many different unions in higher education. My current union has been in the states here as heck, I don't even know anything about them because they're very behind the scenes. But the union up there, what was it? IRFA, I think is what it's called. I think that's right. Um, but they, I mean, they're the type of people who agitate for this sort of stuff. Like they'll
Mm.
send out emails, solidarity with Palestine, kind of thing, or
Yeah,
solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, and it's very inappropriate, I think, if you're going to represent
Yes.
a diverse group of people. It's very inappropriate to be plugging political positions and saying that we as a union stand with such a cause. It's like, no, we as a union are a bunch of different people with a bunch of different opinions.
Yeah,
And just because you can maybe say that the board stands with them, but even that's, I think, inappropriate because it
yeah,
tells you that you should think a certain way. And that's not what the unions are for. The unions are supposed to be there to protect their employees, no matter what side of the political spectrum those employees are on.
mm,
So yeah, I found them less than helpful. I found them less than helpful. I didn't find them actively harmful, but I found them less than helpful.
mm. And just as a final thing, so in your view, what is the thing that will be the most helpful to trying to right the ship of these universities, which have are kind of veering off from their academic mission? What would be not to be solving it, but just at least to move it in a more sensible direction? Is there anything that you think can be done
Yeah,
to assist this?
yeah. So I think there's at least two or three things that can be done, and from I think starting with the most immediate thing is, first of all, uh, we can support each other as faculty members, right? So regardless of whether or not you agree with somebody, if you uphold the values of freedom of expression, you should step up and support your fellow faculty. I have personally stepped up and supported, for example, socialists or far left, and I'm not saying anything about this is a separate thought, not you, Francis, but other socialists, on the left side of the political spectrum. I personally stepped up and said, I think what they said is horrible, but I didn't even say that what they said was horrible. I said, while I don't agree with this, they have the right to say these things, and we need to uphold academic freedom. That's so important. So even if you disagree with somebody, you need to stand up, have a backbone, and say, no, they may have said something that most people find offensive, but that is their right to say it, and I will stand with them. And so we can all go down together. I mean, so that's locally what you can do. Another thing is, if you're a professor and you're listening to this, if you identify students who are probably feeling isolated, or your faculty, your colleagues who are feeling isolated, at least reach out to them and say, hey, I don't think it's right what they're doing to you, and I've got your back. So those are things that you can do immediately. Now, what I think solves this is very, very simple, and that is institutional neutrality, absolute institutional neutrality. Whether that is neutrality, whether that's neutrality is in staying out of politics, or that's neutrality is in not promoting a specific view. Daniel, one of the things that Dr. Page, got dragged for was he had criticized, like you said, a scholarship that was offered only to people in the LGBTQ plus community, and also the unveiling of a Progress Pride flag in the University Center. The University Center, universities are absolutely no place for political statements like that. When I see whenever I see them unveiling a new Progress Pride flag, or even like putting up a Ukrainian flag in a Canadian university, or a pro-Palestine flag, you're taking a political stance. You're violating institutional neutrality. The institution should stay absolutely neutral on all these issues. They should not be seen to be supporting one side or another, right? And I think that is what gets us out of this mess, is having institutional neutrality be the golden rule. It's that the institution does not take any position on a particular issue. Because once you start taking positions on particular issues, what happens is that you wind up with echo chambers, right? And you wind up persecuting, by definition, you wind up persecuting those who hold contrary beliefs. When, say, a conservative Christian or a conservative Muslim or somebody who's more on that persuasion comes to a university, and the first thing they see is pride flags everywhere and celebration of something that they personally find to be morally incorrect, that's saying to them, you're not welcome here. We welcome a certain type of person here, and it is not you. And so I've had people ask me, well, what should they do then? It's like, you should have a state flag or a provincial flag, and maybe the Canadian flag. Or in the States here, you should have the state flag. You should have the United States flag, and the state flag, maybe a school flag, but nothing political. And by allowing anybody to enroll in your university, regardless of what their orientation is, what their race is, what their gender is, that sort of thing, that is your support for those students. You can show your support for students by just supporting students, not singling out special students with special identities. No, just keep it neutral. And I think that's what gets us out of this mess.
Okay. Well, Trevor, I think we'll bring this to a close, but before we end this interview, I'm just wondering if there's anything that you think that needs to be said that hasn't been said.
Keep fighting.
Fight now and fight hard.
Yep,
before it's too late.
exactly.
I'm just amazed people who are not more up in arms about what's happening. And the University of Regina, it's a particularly bad case of universities that have gone off the rails. And I think there was a lot of things exposed by what happened on October 3rd. And Daniel, Paige, and I are working hard to expose it. And we thank you very much for helping us to, have another piece of the puzzle that we're going to include in this
Cool.
document.
Yeah, and they can't fire all of us. So
Thank you very much.
yeah, thanks.